When you spend 57 years beside someone, you believe you know every secret, every sigh, until death reveals that you've been living with a stranger. My name is Eleanor Thompson. I'm 78 years old, and today I'm going to share a story I've kept buried in my heart for a very long time. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you watching now to please leave a like on this video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps me continue sharing my life experiences with all of you. It all began in 1962 on a hot summer afternoon in Springfield, Illinois. I was just 15, braiding my hair on my parents' front porch when I saw Gerald for the first time. He was selling bread on our street, a 20-year-old with broad shoulders and honey-colored eyes that seemed to hide 1,000 secrets. When our gazes met, I felt something I'd never felt before. At that moment, I couldn't have imagined that this shy young man would completely change the course of my life. Gerald started passing by our street every day, even when he had no bread to sell. My father didn't approve at first. He said Gerald didn't have the status or money to court a civil servant's daughter. But as time passed, Gerald secured a better job at the town's textile factory. He was a blue-collar worker, labored hard with calloused hands that told stories of struggle. We married 3 years later, in 1965. I was 18, wearing a simple white dress my mother had spent months sewing. I remember it like it was yesterday. The small church, only 20 guests, the wildflowers my sister picked the morning of the wedding. Gerald wasn't a man of many words, but his eyes shone when he said, "I do." And for me, that was enough. Our house was small, just 2 rooms in the back of my aunt's property. We had almost nothing, but we were happy in those early days. Gerald worked at the factory during the day and, to supplement our income, worked as a night security guard 3 times a week. I took in sewing jobs, helping as I could. Our time together was precious. Sometimes we'd go days without really seeing each other. When he'd come home from guard duty, I was already asleep. When I woke up, he had already left for the factory. Soon came the children. Teresa, our firstborn, arrived in 1966, a girl with bright eyes and an easy smile who showed remarkable intelligence from an early age. Then came Christopher in 1968, serious like his father, quiet and observant. Finally, Amanda arrived in 1970, the youngest who was born with my mother's strong temperament. Our house, though small, was complete. We were a family. The years passed amid diapers, bottles, first words, first steps. Gerald earned a promotion at the factory, and we were able to move to a larger house with 3 bedrooms and even a small backyard where I planted my first rose bushes. Life wasn't luxurious, but it was dignified. We had enough to put food on the table, clean clothes to wear, and our children attended school. But then, in 1975, tragedy knocked on our door without warning. Teresa, just 9 years old, began feeling pain in her legs. At first, we thought they were just growing pains, nothing serious. But soon came the high fever and then difficulty walking. When we finally managed to take her to the city hospital, the diagnosis was devastating: polio in an advanced stage. "Do everything you can for her, doctor," Gerald begged with tears in his eyes. It was the first time I'd heard him cry since we'd met. The doctor just shook his head with that look all parents fear receiving. We spent 3 months living at the hospital. Gerald got leave from the factory, but money began to run short. Christopher and Amanda stayed with my mother while we took turns at Teresa's bedside. I watched my daughter waste away a little each day. Her legs, once so nimble when she ran through the yard, were now immobile. Her bright eyes lost their shine. "Mommy, it hurts so much," she would tell me. And I, helpless, would just hold her small hand in mine, praying for a miracle that never came. On a cold August dawn, Teresa left us. She closed her little eyes forever while I sang her favorite lullaby. The priest said she became an angel, but no words of comfort filled the void that settled in our home. We buried our daughter in a small white coffin, too small to contain so much pain. It was there, in that cemetery, that I noticed the change in Gerald. While I sobbed openly, he remained silent, his face like stone. He didn't shed a single tear during the funeral. And when we returned home, he simply took his coat and left, returning only the next morning, smelling of alcohol. From that day on, Gerald began to change. The silences grew longer, the embraces rarer. The affectionate man I had known was replaced by someone distant, who always seemed to have his thoughts elsewhere. And then the absences began. Entire weekends when he claimed to be doing odd jobs in neighboring towns. "It's for the children's future," he would always reply when I questioned him. "I'm saving money to give Christopher and Amanda a quality education." And I accepted it, swallowing my tears at night while washing his shirts that smelled of perfume different from mine. What choice did I have? I was a woman with little education, 2 small children to raise, in an era when a separated woman had no value in society. My own mother would say, "That's just how men are, honey. Hang in there, think of the children." I cried in secret for years. I prayed for strength. I thought about leaving 1,000 times, but I would look at Christopher and Amanda and stay. They needed a home, stability, their father's name. And Gerald, despite his absences, never let us want for anything. The money came punctually, bills were paid, school supplies were always new at the beginning of the school year. The years passed like this, in that silent arrangement. I learned to live half a life, to not ask questions, to pretend I didn't see the signs. Christopher grew up, became a studious and responsible teenager. Amanda blossomed into a beautiful young woman with a strong personality. They barely spent time with their father, who now passed less and less time at home. "Doesn't Daddy like us?" Amanda asked me once when she was just 12. "Your father loves you in his own way," I answered, not knowing if I was lying. "He works very hard so that you can have opportunities that we didn't have." The truth is, I no longer knew what Gerald felt. Our marriage had become an empty shell, 2 people sharing a roof but rarely a life. We spoke only about practical matters, the electric bill that was due, the uniform Christopher needed for technical school, Amanda's tooth that needed treatment. Sometimes, on the rare nights when we had dinner together, I tried to rekindle something of what we once had. I'd prepare his favorite meal, fix my hair, wear a bit of the perfume he gave me on our first wedding anniversary. But Gerald would just eat in silence, thank me for the meal, and retire to the guest room, where he had begun sleeping, so as not to wake me when he came in late, according to him. I think I got used to that silent pain, like someone who gets used to a chronic illness. I learned to find small joys in Christopher's academic progress, in Amanda's smile, in visits from my sisters, in the rosary I prayed every night asking for strength. Life continued like that, between sighs and resignation. In 1986, Christopher was accepted to engineering school, the first in our family to enter a university. I remember Gerald crying with emotion when we received the news, hugging his son with a pride he hadn't shown in a long time. For a brief moment, we seemed like a normal family again. That night, he slept by my side for the first time in years. "I'm proud of the family we've built, Eleanor," he said before falling asleep. And for a moment, I believed that perhaps we could start over, that perhaps our love could rise from the ashes like a phoenix. But the following week, he returned to his absences, his secrets, and I returned to my life of waiting and silence. I lived for years in that suffocating uncertainty. Each time Gerald returned after a weekend away, I secretly examined his bags, looking for clues to confirm my suspicions. I found only the basics: wrinkled clothes, toiletries, sometimes a newspaper from another town. Never concrete evidence, just that different perfume that tormented me. In 1988, Amanda graduated from high school. She was a determined young woman, different from me in my youth. While I was raised to be a wife and mother, she dreamed of independence. "I don't want to depend on any man, Mom," she would tell me while we studied together for her college entrance exams. Those words cut like a knife. Was it a critique of my own life? Had I been an example of what not to do? At her graduation party, Gerald appeared only at the end, when almost everyone had already left. He justified himself by saying the bus from the neighboring town had been delayed. Amanda pretended not to care, but I saw the disappointment in her eyes when she took the official photograph with only me by her side. Gerald's absence was eternalized in that image, an empty space that nothing could fill. The house grew quieter over time. Christopher was already at university, returning only on weekends. Amanda began working as a secretary at an accounting office while studying at night. Gerald and I were rarely alone together, and when we were, the silence was deafening. At Christmas 1990, I organized a special dinner. I decorated the whole house, cooked for 2 days straight, bought modest but carefully chosen presents. I wanted to bring the family together, to recapture something of the time when we were happy. Christopher brought his girlfriend, a kind young woman named Mary. Amanda came with a young man from her office. Even my sister Irene showed up with her husband. Only Gerald didn't arrive. We waited until 10 o'clock. The food getting cold on the table, embarrassed glances avoiding each other. When the phone rang, I felt my heart race. It was him saying his car had broken down on the road and he couldn't make it. "Celebrate without me," he asked. "It's always like this," Amanda vented after everyone had gone. "We've always had to celebrate without him." I didn't know what to answer. What could I say to justify decades of absence? That night, lying in the bed we once shared with passion, I made a promise to myself. I would discover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. In January, when Gerald left for another one of his odd jobs, I secretly followed him to the bus station. I saw when he bought a ticket to Riverdale, a town 2 hours away. I didn't have the courage to confront him right there, but I noted the destination. The following week, I asked for a day off from the small sewing workshop where I worked and went there, determined to discover what parallel life my husband was leading. Riverdale was a quiet town, smaller than ours. I had no idea where to start looking. I spent the entire day walking its streets, entering establishments, showing an old photo of Gerald, asking if anyone knew him. I received many pitying looks, some curious ones, but no concrete information. I was about to give up when I entered a pharmacy near the bus station. The pharmacist, an elderly gentleman with gray hair and a kind expression, looked at the photo and then at me. "Are you a relative of Mr. Gerald?" he asked. My heart raced. "I'm his wife," I replied, feeling the words bitter in my mouth. The man seemed embarrassed. "He comes here often, buys prescription medications. I thought he was a widower." I felt my legs weaken. I needed to sit down. The pharmacist, seeing my condition, offered me a glass of water. I explained that I was looking for my husband, that I suspected an affair. "I don't know if I should get involved in this, ma'am," he hesitated. "But if you really want to find him, he always picks up the same medication for a woman named Irene. She lives on Maple Street in a house with blue windows." Irene, the same name as my sister, a cruel coincidence. I thanked the pharmacist and walked to the address he indicated, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. The 15-minute journey felt like an eternity. The house was modest but well kept. There were flowers in the garden, curtains in the windows, a home. A few yards from the entrance, I froze. I couldn't take another step. What would I say? How would I face this situation? What if Gerald was there? At that moment, the door opened. A middle-aged woman came out carrying a shopping bag. She had brown hair with some gray strands, her face marked by time. She wasn't beautiful in a conventional way, but there was something in her way of walking, a quiet dignity. Our gazes crossed for an instant, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. She didn't know me, but I already knew who she was, Irene, the other woman. I didn't have the courage to approach her. I turned around and went back to the bus station, catching the first bus back home. During the entire journey, I cried silently, my tears soaking my embroidered handkerchief. It wasn't just the betrayal that devastated me. It was the construction of another life, another home. How long had this been going on? Had it started after Teresa's death, or had it begun before? When I got home, Gerald had already returned. He was sitting in the living room armchair, reading the newspaper, as if nothing had happened, as if he didn't have a second life just a few hours away. "Where were you, Eleanor?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the newspaper. I was worried. The irony of the situation almost made me laugh. He worried about my absence of one day while I had endured his for decades. "I went to visit my cousin in St. Lucie," I lied, with an ease that surprised me. "She needed help with a wedding dress she's sewing." He nodded without questioning. And so our game of lies continued, me pretending not to know, him pretending to have nothing to hide. In the following weeks, my mind was in Riverdale. Who was that woman? What was special about her that kept my husband divided for so many years? The prescription medications indicated some illness. Was it possible that Gerald was taking care of someone who was sick? 1,000 theories passed through my head, none bringing comfort. In February, Christopher announced his engagement to Mary. The wedding would be in December, after his graduation from engineering school. The news brought some joy to our somber house. I focused on the preparations, on sewing the bride's dress, on organizing the small party we would have in our backyard. It was easier to focus on my son's happiness than on the ruins of my marriage. During Gerald's next visit to Riverdale, I didn't follow him. Instead, I used his absence to search our bedroom thoroughly. I looked in every drawer, in every corner of the wardrobe, under the mattress. Nothing. That's when I remembered the attic, that small space above the hallway where we kept old suitcases and boxes of memories. I climbed on the stool, opened the trapdoor, and pulled myself up with difficulty. The space was cramped, dusty. I hadn't been up there in years. I spent hours examining each box, each object. When I was about to go down, I noticed a military trunk hidden behind cardboard boxes. It was leather, with the initials GTS engraved. Gerald Thompson Smith. With trembling hands, I opened the rusty lock. Inside, I found documents, some bundles of money carefully wrapped in brown paper, and a bank book I didn't recognize. Leafing through it, I discovered regular deposits over almost 20 years. A small fortune accumulated slowly, while we lived on a tight budget, saving on every detail. At the bottom of the trunk, under the documents, was an envelope of thick paper. Inside, a photograph that would forever change my understanding of the situation. It showed Gerald, much younger, embracing a beautiful woman who held a newborn baby. On the back of the photo, an inscription, Gerald, Irene, and Agatha, 1960. 2 years before he met me. The baby in the photo must have been 2 years old when Gerald began courting me. A secret that preceded our marriage, our family, our life together. I put everything back exactly as I found it and climbed down from the attic with the weight of that discovery. Gerald had another family even before meeting me. It wasn't just an extramarital affair. It was an entire life built parallel to ours. And that girl in the photo, Agatha, would now be a woman over 30 years old, a daughter he never mentioned. That night, looking at the ceiling of the bedroom, I did the math mentally. If Agatha was born in 1960, she was 5 when I married Gerald, 15 when Teresa died. She must have finished school, perhaps even married, and given Gerald grandchildren, while I lived in ignorance, sharing scraps of time and attention from the man I thought was exclusively my husband. I didn't confront Gerald. Something inside me needed more answers before exploding decades of lies. How could I demand the truth after so long, pretending not to notice the evidence? And what would I gain from it now, when our children were already grown, following their own paths? I would destroy the image they had of their father, expose our family to scandal and humiliation. So, I continued playing my part in that melancholic theater piece, dedicated wife, present mother, skilled seamstress, a woman who swallowed her own dignity for so long that she no longer knew the taste of truth. In August of that year, Amanda gave us the news. She was 3 months pregnant. She wasn't married, which caused an uproar in our traditional family. The father of the child, that same young man from the office, disappeared as soon as he learned of the pregnancy. My daughter, determined as always, decided to raise the baby alone. "I don't need any man, Mom," she said, repeating the phrase she had so often uttered in adolescence. "I'll give my child everything they need." To my surprise, Gerald showed no disapproval. On the contrary, he promised to help Amanda in any way he could. "No grandchild of mine will ever want for anything," he guaranteed, with a conviction he hadn't shown in years. That reaction made me think of Agatha, his other daughter. Had he been a present father for her too? Was he compensating for some guilt, some abandonment in supporting Amanda now? Once again, questions without answers accumulated in my tired heart. The rest of that year passed in a blur. Christopher's wedding in December, Amanda's growing belly, preparations for the arrival of the first grandchild. Gerald seemed more present, more interested in the family. Perhaps the prospect of being a grandfather had softened him, brought him back to the nest we had built. In February 1991, Joaquin was born, our first grandchild, a strong baby with rosy cheeks and expressive eyes like his mother's. Gerald cried when he held him for the first time, murmuring words of affection I hadn't heard from him in a long time. During the first months of Joaquin's life, Amanda stayed with us. I helped with the baby, teaching her the secrets of motherhood I had learned from my own mother decades ago. Gerald reduced his trips, limiting them to once a month, always with the excuse of extra jobs to help with the grandson's expenses. I knew he continued visiting Riverdale, continued his double life, but now, with the hidden photograph in my memory, I understood it wasn't just an extramarital affair. It was a responsibility he carried from before he met me. A responsibility that, for some reason, he couldn't or wouldn't abandon when he decided to build a new family with me. Time passed with that strange normality we had constructed. Joaquin grew strong, filling our house with laughter after so much silence. Amanda got a better job and rented a small apartment near our house. Christopher and Mary gave us 2 more grandchildren, Cecilia in 1993 and Gabriel in 1996. Our family grew, while I kept a secret that weighed more and more. In 1997, I noticed the first changes in Gerald: weight loss, lack of appetite, a fatigue that didn't pass with rest. I insisted he see a doctor, but he refused for months. "It's just the weight of age, woman," he would say, trying to reassure me with a weak smile. But I knew that body even after so many years of distance. I knew something was wrong. His trips to Riverdale continued, even with his health visibly worsening. One Sunday morning, as he prepared for another visit, Gerald fainted in the kitchen. The dull thud of his body against the ceramic floor still echoes in my memory. I called an ambulance in desperation, praying to all the saints I knew. At the hospital, after several tests, came the devastating diagnosis: pancreatic cancer, already in an advanced stage. "How much time does he have?" I asked the doctor, holding back tears. 6 months at most, he replied, with that clinical tone that tried to hide compassion. "We can offer palliative treatments to reduce suffering." I felt the world collapse. Despite everything, despite the lies and absences, Gerald was the man of my life, the father of my children, my companion for more than 3 decades. How would I live without him? And what would happen to the other family, to Irene and Agatha, when they found out? We decided not to tell the children about the severity of the disease, at least not immediately. "Let's first try the treatments," Gerald said, with a serenity that surprised me. On the way home, he held my hand in the taxi. It had been years since we had this kind of spontaneous contact. "Eleanor," he spoke with a weak voice, "I need to put many things in order." I thought he was talking about the will, material possessions, those formalities that precede death. But what he said next changed everything. "I know you discovered about Riverdale." I was paralyzed, my heart beating so hard it seemed about to come out through my mouth. How did he know? Did he notice when I searched his things? Or was it just a guess based on years of mutual suspicion? "Not here, Gerald," I managed to murmur, indicating the taxi driver with my eyes. "When we get home." He agreed with a slight nod, and we remained silent for the rest of the journey. Our hands still joined, as if trying to grasp a past that would never return. At home, I prepared tea, and we sat in the living room, like two strangers about to start a difficult conversation. Gerald seemed to have aged 10 years in just one day, his withered body sinking into the armchair that once barely contained his robust frame. "I want you to know everything," he began, his voice trembling. "I deserve your hatred, but I need you to understand." And then, for the first time in all those years, I heard the complete story. Gerald met Irene in 1958, when he was working as a mason's assistant in Riverdale. She was the daughter of the boarding house owner where he stayed. A youthful and intense romance that resulted in pregnancy. Agatha was born in 1960, and they planned to marry, but her father wouldn't accept it. "He was a violent, proud man," Gerald explained. "He forbade us from seeing each other, threatened to kill me if I didn't disappear from town. I had to leave, find work in another region." Gerald tried to forget, to move on. When he met me in 1962, he had already been almost 2 years without seeing Irene or his daughter. He genuinely fell in love with me, wanting a fresh start. "I wasn't lying when I said I loved you, Ellie. It was true. You were everything I wanted for my life. We married, had our children, built our home." He really believed the past was behind him. Until in 1970, he received a letter. Irene had finally gotten his address through a mutual acquaintance. Her father had died, and she desperately needed help. Agatha, then 10 years old, constantly asked about the father she had never known. I went there to tell her I had another family, that I couldn't be part of their lives anymore. But when I saw my daughter, those eyes looking at me for the first time, I couldn't say no. From then on, he began visiting them monthly, taking what he could from his tight salary. He didn't resume the romance with Irene. She herself had another partner at the time. He was just a father trying to compensate for years of absence. Until 1975, when we lost Teresa, everything changed. In the same month, Irene had a psychotic break. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Her partner abandoned her. Agatha, at 15, was left alone to care for her sick mother. The tragic coincidence of events tore him apart inside. On one side, a wife destroyed by the death of her daughter. On the other, an ex-lover with mental illness and a helpless teenager. He then decided he couldn't abandon either of the two families. "I promised myself I would take care of all of you, even if it meant living divided. The extra jobs, the trips, all to get enough money for 2 houses, 2 sets of responsibilities. The money in the bank book I found in the attic was for Irene's treatment and Agatha's education." As he spoke, I felt a storm of emotions: anger at the lie maintained for decades, compassion for the impossible situation he faced, sadness for all the years lost in silences and suspicions, but above all, a strange sense of relief at finally knowing the truth. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice choked. "We could have found a solution together, perhaps even helped somehow." Gerald lowered his eyes, ashamed. "At first, I was afraid of losing you. Then, as time passed, it became increasingly difficult to reveal such a long lie. And I also feared you might force me to choose. And I couldn't abandon Agatha and Irene, not after having already abandoned them once." We remained silent for long minutes, digesting the revelations. Outside, night had fallen. The wall clock marked almost 10 o'clock. A lifetime of secrets revealed in one conversation. "Does Agatha know about us?" I finally asked. She always knew. Irene made sure she understood. She said we needed to be honest with the girl, even if the rest of the world lived in lies. Another blow, knowing I was the only one kept in ignorance during all those years. The daughter I didn't even know knew more about my life than I did myself. "And how is Irene now? And Agatha?" Gerald sighed heavily. "Irene is stable with medication, but needs constant supervision. Agatha married, has 2 children, is a nurse at the municipal hospital, an extraordinary woman despite everything she went through. Grandchildren I never met. A stepdaughter who cared for the sick while I nursed grievances. The irony didn't escape me. In the days that followed, while Gerald began palliative treatments, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I asked for Irene and Agatha's address. I wanted to meet them, to better understand that part of my husband's life that remained hidden for so long. He hesitated. "Are you sure, Ellie? I don't want to cause more suffering for anyone." "I'm sure. I think after so many years living in lies, I deserve to know the whole truth." Gerald gave me the address and a note to deliver to Agatha, explaining the situation. On a Tuesday morning, I took the bus to Riverdale. The 2-hour journey seemed endless, each mile bringing me closer to a confrontation I never imagined facing. The house with blue windows was the same as the last time I saw it years ago. The garden remained well tended, with colorful flowers framing the entrance. I took several deep breaths before knocking on the door. A woman around 37 answered. I immediately recognized the honey-colored eyes, Gerald's same determined expression. Agatha had the posture of someone who had carried responsibilities from an early age. "Yes?" she asked politely. "It's me, Eleanor," I replied, my mouth dry. Gerald's wife. Her face instantly paled. She looked to the sides, as if checking if any neighbor was watching, and then opened the door wider. "Come in, please. I've been expecting your visit for decades." The house was modest but welcoming. In the living room, an old armchair positioned facing the television. On the walls, family photographs. In many of them, Gerald appeared at graduations, birthdays, important moments I missed in our own home. "My mother is resting," Agatha explained, indicating a closed door. "The medications make her drowsy in the morning." Nodding, I handed her Gerald's note. She read it quickly, her eyes filling with tears. "So he's dying," she murmured, more to herself than to me. 6 months, according to the doctors. We sat in the small kitchen. Agatha prepared coffee, moving with the efficiency of someone who knows the space well. We talked for hours. She told me about her childhood, waiting for her father's visits, about her mother's episodes, which began when she was 15, about how Gerald never failed to send money for the medications, even when treatments became expensive. "He visited us every month without fail," she explained. "When Mom was in crisis, he would stay here for days, taking care of her so I could study or rest." I imagined Gerald, exhausted after a week of heavy work, spending his rare days off caring for a woman with mental illness, a side of him I never knew. "He talked about you all too," continued Agatha, serving more coffee. "About Teresa, who left so young, about Christopher, the engineer who fills him with pride, about Amanda and her strong temperament, so similar to mine." I remained silent, processing that information. My children present in this woman's life through stories told by her father. 2 families separated by just a few miles and an abyss of secrets. "He paid for my nursing school," Agatha continued. "He worked overtime to save every penny. When I graduated, it was the happiest day of his life. He said he had finally done something right for me." I asked about her children, my unknown grandchildren. Fernando was 12 years old, Mariana 9. Both knew about their grandfather who came to visit them monthly, bringing small presents and stories. "They adore Grandpa Gerald," she said with a sad smile. "They'll miss him terribly." When Irene woke up, Agatha introduced me with caution. I feared finding resentment or hostility, but the 60-year-old woman who entered the kitchen had gentle, tired eyes. "So you're Eleanor," she said, sitting with us. "Gerald always said you were beautiful." I didn't know how to respond to that. I thanked her awkwardly while observing the face marked by years and illness. Irene had a faded beauty, reminiscent of the young woman in the photograph I found in the attic. "He loved you, you know," she continued with a lucidity that surprised me. "In the first years, when Agatha was little, he would come secretly just to see her. He said he had built a life with you, that he was happy." I understood. I also moved on until illness came. The disarming honesty of that woman moved me. There was no bitterness in her voice, just the acceptance of a life that didn't go as planned. After I got sick, he became our guardian angel, she continued, as Agatha held her hand affectionately. If it weren't for Gerald, I would have been committed to one of those horrible asylums. You know how they treated the mentally ill back then. They were discarded, forgotten. Thanks to him, I was able to stay at home with my daughter, receiving proper treatment. The hours passed as we talked. 3 women united by love for the same man, each in her own way. As night began to fall, I said goodbye, promising to return. Before leaving, Agatha gave me some photographs for Dad, as she said, "Tell him we love him and that we understand everything he did." On the bus back, watching the city lights through the window, I cried silently. They weren't tears of anger or betrayal, but of a late and painful understanding. Gerald wasn't the absent and unfaithful husband I had imagined for so many years. He was a man divided between 2 worlds, carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. When I got home, he was awake, anxious for news. His eyes, already sunken from the disease, lit up when I handed him the photographs. "Are they okay?" he asked, his voice weak. "They are. They send their love." He held my hand, silent tears running down his wrinkled face. "And you, Eleanor, after all you've discovered, can you still love me?" I sat beside him on the bed, caressing the few white hairs he had left. "I don't know if it's love, Gerald, but it's understanding and forgiveness and gratitude for the wonderful children you gave me. Perhaps that's what remains of love after so many years and so much pain." He nodded, seeming to find some comfort in my words. That night, I slept by his side for the first time in years, listening to his difficult breathing, feeling the fragile warmth of that body I once knew so well. The disease advanced mercilessly, consuming Gerald day by day. We abandoned the idea of hiding the gravity of the situation from the children. They needed to know, needed to say goodbye. Christopher, always practical, organized a schedule so that we could take turns caring for him. Amanda cried for hours when she found out, blaming herself for all the moments of resentment she had harbored toward her father over the years. "Don't tell them about Riverdale," Gerald asked one afternoon when we were alone. "Let them remember me only as the father they knew." I respected his request, though I disagreed. Secrets had already caused enough damage in our family, but I had no right to reveal this part of his life, not without his permission. What Gerald didn't know was that I continued visiting Irene and Agatha. Every 2 weeks, while he rested under Amanda's care or the nurse we hired, I would take the bus to Riverdale. I brought news about his condition, photographs of the grandchildren they never met, stories of our life together. During one of these visits, Agatha handed me a carved wooden box. "These are the letters Dad wrote to Mom over the years," she explained. "We thought you should have them." I was surprised by the gesture. "Are you sure? They're precious memories?" "We have our memories," replied Irene, with that serenity that only those who have faced the worst in life possess. "And we made copies of the most important ones. You deserve to know this part of him." I brought the box home, hidden in the crochet bag I had made years ago. At night, when Gerald finally fell asleep, after taking the morphine that eased his pain, I climbed to the attic with a lantern. I sat on the dusty floor among the forgotten memories of our life and began to read. The letters were organized by date, beginning in 1970, when Irene found him again. The first ones were formal, almost distant, reports on Agatha's health, information about the money sent, promises of future visits. As the years passed, the tone changed. Gerald began to share more about his life with us, about his unrealized dreams, about the weight of living divided. "My dear Irene," said a letter from 1976. "Yesterday marked 1 year since Teresa's passing. Eleanor still cries every night, thinking I don't notice. How can I explain to her that I cry too, but need to be strong for everyone? How can I tell her that I carry not only the pain of losing one daughter, but the guilt of not being present enough in the life of another? Agatha turns 15 this month. the same age Teresa will never reach. Tears blurred my vision as I read those words written more than 2 decades ago. Gerald, always so contained, revealed in the letters an emotional depth he never showed at home. He spoke about his anguish, his fears, his constant struggle to support 2 families in times of economic crisis. Wages were cut again at the factory, he wrote in 1982. But don't worry, I got an extra job as a security guard at the warehouse on Saturdays. The money for the medications will keep arriving punctually. I remembered the many times I mentally criticized him for his absence on weekends, for the worn clothes he insisted on wearing, for the old car he never traded even when Christopher insisted he could help financially. Every sacrifice I attributed to avarice or neglect was in reality to ensure that Irene had her medications, that Agatha could study. The letters from the 1980s reported Irene's more severe crises, periods when she needed to be briefly hospitalized. Gerald described how he juggled work, our home, and the hospital, sleeping only a few hours a night, driving hundreds of miles weekly to be present where needed. "Sometimes I think I'll fall apart, my friend," he confessed in a 1985 letter. "Yesterday, while driving back home after dropping Agatha off at college, I nearly fell asleep at the wheel. I stopped on the road and cried like a child, not from exhaustion, but from the lost time. For the birthdays I missed, for the nights I didn't sleep beside Eleanor, for the graduations I saw only in photographs. Life passes too quickly when you live it divided." In 1990, when Agatha graduated in nursing, Gerald wrote a particularly moving letter. "Today, I watched our daughter receive her diploma, Irene. She was beautiful, confident, strong, like you always were. The moment she went on stage, I thought of Teresa, of how she never had this chance. I also thought of Christopher, who will graduate in engineering next year, and how I'll have to choose which ceremony to attend, since they'll be around the same time. These are the impossible choices that define my existence. But today, seeing Agatha's proud smile, I felt that at least I did something right in this life so full of mistakes." The letters continued year after year, documenting not just his relationship with Irene and Agatha, but also his thoughts about us, about aging, about the regrets he accumulated. In 1996, when his first grandchild with Agatha was born, Gerald wrote, "Fernando was born with my eyes, Irene. The same look that Agatha inherited, that Teresa had, that I now see in Joaquin and Cecilia. Blood of my blood, spread across 2 families that will never meet. What a divided grandfather will I be for these children." I read until dawn, absorbing 3 decades of confessions, discovering a man I barely knew, despite sharing my roof with him. When I finished, I carefully put the letters back in the box and hid it in the attic, among the old suitcases that silently witnessed our history. Going down the stairs, I found Amanda already awake, preparing breakfast. "You spent the whole night in the attic, Mom?" she asked, concerned. "I heard noises up there." "Just organizing some old things," I replied, avoiding her perceptive eyes. "How is your father?" "The night was difficult. He moaned a lot in pain, even with the morphine. The doctor is coming to see him today." I nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion and revelations. I quickly had coffee and went to the bedroom, where Gerald had just awakened. He was so thin, he almost disappeared among the sheets. His eyes, once so alive, now seemed sunken in a face that had aged decades in just a few months. "Good morning, Eleanor," he murmured, trying to smile. "You look tired." "I didn't sleep well," I replied, helping him sit up to drink water. "Worried about you." He held my hand with surprising strength. "I need to tell you something important." I sat beside him, my heart racing. Did he notice my visits to Riverdale? Had he discovered about the letters? "I wrote a letter for you," he said, pointing to the drawer of the nightstand. "For when I'm gone, but I wanted you to know. I'm at peace with everything, with my choices, my mistakes. I did the best I could with the cards life dealt me." Nodding, I held back tears. "I know, Gerald, I know." In the following weeks, his condition rapidly worsened. The cancer spread to his liver, then to his bones. The pain became unbearable, to the point where we constantly needed to increase the morphine dose. Christopher brought his family to stay with us, wanting the grandchildren to be able to say goodbye to their grandfather. Amanda practically moved into our bedroom, sleeping on the floor beside her father's bed. On a particularly difficult afternoon, when Gerald was oscillating between consciousness and drug-induced delirium, he called for Agatha. Christopher, who was in the room at that moment, frowned. "Who is Agatha, Dad?" he asked, confused. I quickly intervened. "It's the name of the hospital nurse, son. Your father must be confusing things because of the medication." Christopher accepted the explanation, but the episode left me alert. Gerald's secrets were at risk of being revealed in his final moments, when he would no longer have control over his words. That night, I made a decision. I picked up the phone and called Agatha. "Your father is very ill," I said, without beating around the bush. "I think it's time for you to come say goodbye." There was silence on the other end of the line. "But what about your children? Do they know about us?" "No, but that doesn't matter anymore. Your father deserves to see you and Irene one last time. I'll deal with the consequences." The next day, while Christopher was taking the children for a brief outing and Amanda had gone to buy more adult diapers, I received Agatha and Irene in our home. Irene, now using a cane and with completely white hair, seemed as fragile as a bird. Agatha supported her with a care that only years of nursing could teach. "Thank you for calling us," said Agatha, briefly embracing me at the door. "We didn't know if we would have this opportunity." I led them to the bedroom, where Gerald was sleeping a restless sleep. Hearing our entrance, he opened his eyes with difficulty. For a moment he seemed confused, as if he didn't believe what he was seeing. "Irene," he murmured, extending his trembling hand. "Agatha, are you really here? Or is it the morphine playing tricks on me?" "We're here, Dad," replied Agatha, holding his hand and kissing his forehead. "We've come to say goodbye." Irene approached the other side of the bed, silent tears running down her wrinkled face. "My old friend," she said with a choked voice. "We've had a long journey together, haven't we?" Gerald smiled weakly, looking at me with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "Eleanor, you brought them?" "Yes," I replied, trying to maintain composure. I thought it was the right thing to do. The four of us remained in that room for almost 2 hours. Gerald, gathering strength from some mysterious place, sat up in bed and conversed lucidly. He asked for news of the grandchildren, wanted to know how things were in Riverdale. He worried about Irene's health and Agatha's work. At one point, he held our hands, mine and Irene's, and looked deeply into our eyes. "Forgive me," he said simply to both, "for not being the man you deserved." "You were exactly the man we needed," replied Irene with a wisdom that only great sufferers attain. "Imperfect, divided, but present in your own way." The bedroom door opened suddenly. Amanda entered, carrying bags from the pharmacy, and froze at the scene. Her eyes scanned the room, stopping at Agatha, whose face, so similar to Gerald's, left no doubt about who she was. "Mom," she questioned, confused and alarmed. "What's happening here?" I took a deep breath, facing my daughter with determination. "Amanda, these are Irene and Agatha. They've come to say goodbye to your father." "Say goodbye? Why? Who are they?" Before I could answer, Gerald intervened, his voice weak but firm. "Amanda, my daughter, this is your half-sister Agatha. Irene was my first companion before I met your mother." The shock on Amanda's face gave way to understanding, then to anger. She dropped the bags on the floor and left, slamming the door. I heard her hurried footsteps down the hallway, then the front door slamming shut. "I'll talk to her," I said, getting up. Gerald held my arm. "No, Eleanor, let her process. She'll understand eventually, as you did." At that moment, we heard Christopher's car arriving. Agatha and Irene stood up tensely. "We should go," said Agatha. "We don't want to cause more problems." "No," I responded firmly. "Enough of secrets and separations. It's time for the whole family to meet." The following minutes were chaotic and emotional. Christopher entered the room accompanied by his children, stopping abruptly at the sight of the unknown visitors. I explained quickly, watching the confusion on his face give way to disbelief, then to reluctant acceptance. "So, I have a sister?" he asked, looking directly at Agatha. "And nieces and nephews I've never met?" "Yes," she replied, holding his gaze. "Fernando and Mariana. They know about you too." Dad always spoke of his family with pride. The children, sensing the tension in the environment, remained quiet, observing the adults with curiosity. Christopher, always the most sensible in the family, took a deep breath and extended his hand to Agatha. "I think we have a lot to talk about," he said. "But now let's focus on what matters, being with our father in his final moments." Amanda returned an hour later, her eyes red from crying. She entered the room silently, where now the entire family, both families, was gathered around Gerald's bed. She approached Agatha slowly, studying her face intensely. "You have his eyes," she finally said. "And the same way of crossing your arms." Agatha smiled timidly. "And you have his temperament?" "Dad always said we were similar in that." A small smile appeared on Amanda's lips. It wasn't forgiveness or complete acceptance, but it was a beginning. Gerald observed everything with an expression of peace I hadn't seen on his face in decades. His two families finally united, cautiously conversing, finding common ground, sharing stories about the man who, despite all his flaws, they loved in their own way. That night, when everyone had gone, Irene and Agatha to a small hotel in town, promising to return the next morning. Christopher and family to their house, needing to organize the children. Amanda to her apartment, still processing the revelations. I was left alone with Gerald. He seemed exhausted, but strangely invigorated. "Thank you," he murmured, holding my hand, "for doing what I didn't have the courage to do in life." "You're still alive, Gerald," I replied, adjusting his pillow. "And you've lived long enough to see your families united. That's not a small thing." He smiled weakly, closing his eyes. "In the attic, there are more letters for all of you, for when I'm gone." I nodded, caressing his sparse white hair. "Rest now. Tomorrow will be another day." But we both knew there wouldn't be many tomorrows ahead. The disease advanced relentlessly, and even the brief joy of that meeting couldn't postpone the inevitable. The cancer continued its silent work, consuming what remained of the man I had loved, hated, and finally understood. Gerald departed on a silent April dawn as a fine rain hit the window. I was by his side holding his hand when he opened his eyes one last time. He said nothing. There was no more strength for words. He just looked at me with an intensity that carried decades of untold stories. Then, a long sigh, and the hand that held mine completely relaxed. That's how 57 years of marriage came to an end, without fanfare. Agatha was sleeping in the corner armchair, exhausted after nights alternating with Amanda and me in caring for him. I didn't wake her immediately. I stayed for a few minutes just observing Gerald, his face finally free of the pain marks that had tormented him in recent months. He seemed at peace, as if the burden he carried throughout his life had finally been set down. The funeral was simple, as he would have wanted. Christopher took care of the practical arrangements, while Amanda made sure the pastor mentioned Teresa in his prayers. To the surprise of many in the small town, 2 families lined up before the coffin. On the left side, me with my children and grandchildren. On the right side, Irene, supported by Agatha and her 2 children. Whispers ran through the church, but I didn't care. The secrets had already caused too much suffering. After the burial, everyone came to our house. The children, still confused by the discovery of new cousins, soon found affinities in the improvised games in the backyard. The adults remained in the living room in cautious conversations, trying to fill decades of absence in a few hours. Observing that unlikely scene, I felt a pang of sadness. Why couldn't Gerald see this in life? Why did he carry alone a secret that, revealed, proved less monstrous than the silence that enveloped it. When everyone had gone, I climbed to the attic. The box of letters Gerald mentioned was exactly where he indicated, behind the old military trunk. It was dark wood, carved with floral motifs. I recognized the handcrafted work of Theodore, the carpenter who lived on the corner of our street in the 80s. The lock was unlocked. Inside were 7 sealed envelopes with names written in Gerald's shaky handwriting. 1 for me, 1 for Christopher, 1 for Amanda, 1 for Agatha, 1 for Irene, and 2 for the grandchildren. 1 addressed to the grandchildren of Springfield and another to the grandchildren of Riverdale. I distributed the envelopes according to the recipients. I handed Irene's and Agatha's at the small hotel where they were staying before returning to Riverdale. I left my children's on their beds, and I kept the grandchildren's for when they were older and could better understand. Mine I took to the bedroom that I shared with Gerald for so long. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I slowly opened the envelope that bore my name. Inside were several pages covered with Gerald's handwriting, already deformed by weakness, but still recognizable. "My dear Eleanor," the letter began, "when your eyes scan these words, I will have already departed. I don't expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it, but I would like you to know the whole truth. Not just fragments discovered in investigations, not just confessions extracted by the imminence of death, but the complete story of a man who lived divided between duty and heart." The letter continued, narrating how he met Irene in 1958, the youthful romance, the unexpected pregnancy, the violent rejection by her father. How he had to flee, abandoning her pregnant after death threats, how he wandered through different cities, carrying the guilt of that abandonment. "When I met you that afternoon in 1962, Eleanor, it was as if the sun had emerged after years of storm. I didn't plan to fall in love, didn't plan to build another family, but it happened, and it was real. Every moment of joy we lived, every child we had, every dream we built, everything was genuine. Never doubt that." In 1970, when he received Irene's letter, he was living the happiest moment of our marriage. Amanda had just been born. Christopher was taking his first steps. Teresa charmed everyone with her precocious intelligence. Our house, though modest, was full of life and plans. I planned to go to Riverdale just to close that chapter, to tell Irene that I had another life, another family. But when I saw Agatha at 10 years old, with the same eyes I saw in Teresa every morning, I couldn't turn my back again. The guilt of abandonment was too heavy. I promised myself I would be present in her life, that I would help financially, that I wouldn't run from my responsibilities as I had once done. Initially, the visits were sporadic. Once every few months, always with the excuse of extra jobs to justify the absences. Irene had remarried. Agatha had a present stepfather. Gerald was just a peripheral figure, fulfilling a moral obligation he imposed on himself. Then came 1975, the year that changed everything. First, we lost our Teresa. The pain was so great he could barely breathe, let alone be the support I needed. While we struggled to overcome that loss, he received a desperate phone call from Agatha. Irene had tried to take her own life. Her marriage had ended. The stepfather who had raised Agatha for years had left, taking with him the little stability they had. Gerald rushed to Riverdale, finding an unrecognizable Irene admitted to a precarious psychiatric institution. Agatha, at just 15, was alone, not knowing how to proceed. The doctors diagnosed schizophrenia, a condition that would require continuous and expensive treatment. At that moment, Eleanor, I made an impossible choice. I couldn't abandon them, not with Irene sick and Agatha still a teenager, but I also couldn't abandon you and our children, especially after the loss of Teresa. Deciding which family to destroy was unthinkable, so I did what seemed the only path. I tried to support both, physically, emotionally, financially. The following years were of constant sacrifice. Gerald worked 3 different jobs, slept only a few hours a night, drove hundreds of miles weekly. The money, always counted, was divided between two houses, two families, two parallel lives. Many times I thought about telling you the truth, Eleanor, especially on nights when I saw you cry silently, thinking I was asleep, but the shame was greater than the courage. How to explain years of lies? How to justify a double life without seeming like a selfish monster? And there was always the fear. What if you forced me to choose? If I lost you and our children? If I lost Agatha and Irene again? The letter continued for several pages, detailing how he balanced that impossible existence for decades, how he used lunch hours to work overtime, how he slept in the car between one job and another. The physical wear, the emotional exhaustion, the constant guilt. I wasn't the husband you deserved, Eleanor, nor the father our children needed. My presence was always divided, my attention fragmented. At important moments, I was often physically present but mentally absent, worried about the other family. The birthdays I missed, the school presentations I attended distractedly, the intimate conversations I avoided for fear of revealing my secret. All these are debts I can never pay. In the last pages, Gerald addressed the most recent years, how the arrival of grandchildren brought a new dimension to his divided life, how the weight of secrets became heavier with age, how the imminence of death forced him to confront the consequences of his choices. When I received the diagnosis, Eleanor, my first thought wasn't fear of death, but relief. Relief from knowing that the burden I carried for decades would finally end, that the lies, the secrets, the absences justified with increasingly fragile excuses would come to an end, that I could finally rest. But along with the relief came concern for the future of both families. How would Irene sustain herself without my financial help? How would you, Eleanor, deal with the truth if you discovered it? What would happen when the two parts of my life inevitably collided? The money in the savings account you found in the attic is to guarantee Irene's treatment for the time she has left. I've already arranged for it to be transferred to an account in her name. The rest of our assets, our house, our savings, everything is rightfully yours, Eleanor. We built it together with your work as hard as mine. In the last lines, written in an almost illegible handwriting, Gerald made a final request. I don't know what will happen after my departure. If you'll discover the whole truth, if the two families will meet, if my children will understand the choices of their imperfect father, I can only ask, with what dignity I have left, that you try not to hate me completely, that you find among so many flaws something worthy of being remembered. That you explain to our children and grandchildren that I wasn't a monster, just a weak man facing impossible choices. I loved you, Eleanor, not as you deserved, not as you dreamed when we married, but I loved you the only way I knew how. With all my imperfections, with all my cowardice, with all my flawed humanity. Forgive me, Gerald. I finished reading with my face wet with tears. They weren't tears of anger or betrayal, but of a deep and late understanding. Gerald wasn't the villain I imagined in the years of solitude, nor the saint his children idealized. He was just human, terribly human, facing circumstances that overwhelmed him. In the days following the funeral, I began reorganizing the house. It was strange to occupy alone the spaces I had shared for decades, even if only physically, with Gerald. Every corner held memories, some sweet, others bitter, all now reinterpreted in light of the revelations. Christopher and Amanda came daily, concerned about my sudden solitude. They brought food, helped with cleaning, tried to convince me to move closer to them. But I didn't want to leave that house. Not yet. There was still something more to do. A week after the funeral, I gathered the entire family, both families, in our living room. Christopher and Mary with their children, Amanda with Joaquin, Agatha with her husband and the two boys, and Irene, fragile but lucid, leaning on her cane. 9 people who shared the same blood, but barely knew each other. Thank you for coming, I began, nervous about what I was about to propose. I know we're all still processing not just the loss of Gerald, but also the revelations of the last few days. Each of us has our own sorrows, our own unanswered questions, but I believe he would want us to move forward, not as strangers united by a secret, but as a family. I explained that I had made a decision. Our house, too big for me alone, would be sold. With the money, I would buy 2 smaller houses, one in Springfield, near Christopher, and another in Riverdale, close to Agatha. I intend to divide my time between the 2 cities, get to know my Riverdale grandchildren better, help with Irene's care. I can't recover the lost years, but I can build something new from here. At first, there was resistance. Amanda, still processing the idea of a half-sister, questioned why I would assume responsibility for Dad's other family. Christopher worried about my health, about the constant travel between cities at 78 years old. Agatha was embarrassed, arguing that I shouldn't feel obligated to take care of them. It's not obligation, I explained, looking at each of them. It's choice. For decades, I lived without real choices, trapped in a life I didn't completely understand. Now, with the truth revealed, I can finally decide my own path, and I choose to unite what Gerald kept separate for so long. Slowly, the resistance gave way to acceptance, then to cautious enthusiasm. We planned monthly lunches alternating between the 2 cities. We organized a group in a messaging app to share photographs of the grandchildren. We arranged joint vacations for the next summer at a small beach inn. 3 months after Gerald's departure, I sold our house. It was painful, of course. Every corner held memories of a lifetime. But as I closed the door for the last time, I felt not only loss, but also liberation. My new routine established itself naturally. 2 weeks in Springfield, 2 weeks in Riverdale. In Springfield, I helped Christopher with the children while he and Mary worked. I had Sunday lunches with Amanda and Joaquin. I listened to her stories about work. I advised when asked. In Riverdale, I accompanied Irene to medical consultations, taught knitting to Mariana, watched Fernando's football games. I discovered, to my surprise, that Irene and I had much in common besides love for the same man. We shared a taste for Russian literature, a passion for gardening, skill with handcrafts. On afternoons when her health allowed, we would sit on her house's porch, knitting and talking about books, recipes, memories. "It's strange, isn't it?" she commented once as she finished a scarf for her grandson. "We spent decades as rivals without knowing, and now, in old age, we've become friends." "Perhaps that's how Gerald would like it to be," I replied, watching the birds in the garden we planted together, all the pieces finally fitting. Agatha became like a daughter to me, though we had begun as strangers. Her strength, her capacity to forgive, her dedication to her mother and children won me over completely. In her, I saw traits of Gerald that made me smile, the stubbornness, the determination, the way she furrowed her brow when concentrating. As for the letters, I kept them carefully, those Gerald wrote to Irene over the years, those he left for each of us before departing. Someday, when the grandchildren are adults and can understand life's complexity, I'll hand them over so they can know their grandfather in all his dimensions. Today, at 78 years old, I understand that life rarely follows the paths we plan in youth. Fairy tales don't mention impossible choices, heavy secrets, divided loves. They don't speak of late forgiveness, of mended families, of reconciliations after death. When I look back at the 57 years I lived beside a man I never completely knew, I don't feel only the pain of betrayal. I also feel gratitude for the wonderful children we had, for the moments of genuine joy, for the chance to finally understand the whole story. The letters in the attic changed everything I knew about our life, but they also gave me a new life to build, an expanded family to love, a purpose for the years I have left. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is Gerald's true legacy. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of forgiveness and new beginnings. I also want to know in the comments if you've ever experienced a situation where you discovered secrets that changed your perspective about someone you loved. Thank you for listening to me today, and until the next story.